The crystal champagne flute in Elena's hand caught the chandelier's light, a perfect picture of high society elegance, until her gaze lingered a second too long on the man across the room, a man who wasn't her husband. That single, unguarded look held a terrifying intimacy that shattered Gabriel's illusion of a quiet evening, whispering a secret he wasn't supposed to know yet. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the silent agreement between two strangers that he no longer mattered in his own marriage. If you find yourself drawn to the jagged edges of broken trust and the quiet storms before a life falls apart, stay with me, because the silence is about to get very loud. The air in the ballroom of the Drake Hotel was thin, recycled, and smelled expensively of lilies and old money. For Gabriel Thorne, it smelled like failure. He stood near the periphery of the room, nursing a glass of sparkling water he didn't want, watching his wife, Elena, work the crowd. She was radiant. The emerald silk of her gown clung to her in a way that commanded attention, a visual declaration of her success as the VP of Sterling PR. She laughed at something a banking CEO said, her hand resting lightly, intimately, on the man's forearm. It was a professional touch, Gabriel told himself. Just business. But lately, the line between business and betrayal had blurred. Gabriel, isn't it? He turned to see an older man with silver hair and eyes that scanned Gabriel's fraying cuffs. It was Marcus Sterling, Elena's boss. Good evening, Marcus, Gabriel said, forcing a smile that felt tight on his face. Haven't seen you at the firm lately, Marcus said, his tone dripping with false joviality. Elena tells me things are slow for you. The architecture business is tough, brutal market. I'm restructuring, Gabriel said, the standard lie tasting like ash. Taking some time to focus on sustainable design. Right, sustainable, Marcus chuckled, patting Gabriel's shoulder with pitying force. Well, lucky for you, Elena is carrying the torch. She's a shark. You chose well, son. Just make sure you don't become dead weight. Sharks have to keep moving, you know. Marcus drifted away, leaving the insult hanging in the air like cigar smoke. Gabriel's grip on the glass tightened. Dead weight. Is that how they talked about him? Is that how she talked about him? He needed air. The noise of the gala, the clinking crystal, the performative laughter, was suddenly deafening. He wove through the crowd, heading toward the terrace doors. He needed to find Elena, to tell her he was leaving, that his headache was back, that he couldn't play the role of the trophy husband without the trophy. The terrace was shadowed, cooled by the wind coming off Lake Michigan. He saw the silhouette of a couple in the far corner, obscured by a large potted fern. He turned to leave, not wanting to interrupt, until he heard the voice. He's just exhausted, Julian. I'm exhausted. It was Elena. Her voice wasn't professional now. It was low, unguarded, stripped of the polish she wore for the cameras. Then leave him, a man's voice replied. Deep, smooth. Julian Vance. The real estate developer Gabriel had lost a bid to last month. You've been saying you would for a year. Gabriel froze in the shadows of the doorway. His heart hammered against his ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. It's not that simple, Elena sighed, the sound of a lighter clicking followed by the exhale of smoke. He has nothing. If I leave now, I look like the villain who abandoned her husband when he went broke. My image is everything, Julian. So you stay out of pity? I stay because it's cheaper than a divorce right now. Elena laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that Gabriel had never heard before. He still thinks his little green housing sketches are going to change the world. It's pathetic, really. I come home to a dreamer with empty pockets, and I have to pretend I believe in him. You deserve a king, Elena, not a court jester. I know, she whispered. God, I look at him sometimes, sitting at that drafting table with his unpaid bills, and I just feel repulsed. I'd rather sleep on the floor than sleep with him right now. The glass in Gabriel's hand didn't break, but something inside his chest did. It was a clean, silent fracture. The heat of shame that had burned him all evening suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, numbing clarity. He wasn't a husband. He was a charity case, a prop, an anchor she was waiting to cut loose. He watched through the leaves as Julian leaned in and kissed her, possessive, hungry. Elena didn't pull away. She melted into it, her hand tangling in Julian's hair, finding a comfort there she hadn't sought from Gabriel in years. Gabriel stepped back, the movement silent on the marble floor. He didn't storm out. He didn't scream. He simply turned around and walked back into the ballroom. The lights seemed brighter now, exposing every flaw in the room, every fake smile. He walked past the bar, past the exit, and out into the Chicago night. The valet asked for his ticket. No, Gabriel said, his voice steady, terrifyingly calm. I'll walk. Sir, it's raining. I know, Gabriel said, looking up at the dark clouds swirling above the skyline. I need the wash. He walked into the downpour, the water soaking his cheap tuxedo, washing away the scent of lilies and old money. He didn't look back at the hotel. He didn't look back at his life. The construction of his empire wouldn't begin with a blueprint. It would begin with a demolition. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was a seamless glide, a mechanical perfection that felt mocking compared to the chaotic storm raging inside Gabriel's chest. He dripped water onto the polished marble floor of the foyer, his tuxedo ruined, his skin numb. The penthouse was dark, save for the ambient city glow bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a space he had designed. Sharp angles, minimalist aesthetics, cold stone. And tonight, it felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. He didn't turn on the lights. He simply peeled off the wet layers of his tuxedo, leaving the sodden pile on the bathroom floor, and changed into jeans and a dark sweater. He sat in the living room chair, facing the door, and waited. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the lock tumbled. Elena entered in a flurry of movement, kicking off her heels with a sigh that echoed too loudly in the cavernous space. She didn't see him at first. She moved to the kitchen island, pouring herself a glass of water, her movements slightly uncoordinated. The emerald dress was rumpled now, and there was a flush to her cheeks that wasn't from the cold. Gabriel? She started when she noticed his silhouette in the armchair. God, you scared me. Why are you sitting in the dark? Thinking, he said. His voice was raspy, but steady. Elena scoffed, taking a sip of water. Always thinking. That's your problem. You think too much and do too little. She walked past him toward the bedroom, the scent of rain and Julian's expensive cologne trailing in her wake. It was a physical blow, that smell. I'm going to bed. Don't wake me up when you decide to come join the real world. The bedroom door clicked shut. Gabriel waited. He waited for 10 minutes, then 20, listening to the silence of the apartment settle. He needed to be sure. He needed the finality of her unconsciousness to make his move. When he finally stood up, his legs felt heavy, but his mind was crystal clear. He walked into the bedroom. Elena was sprawled across the Egyptian cotton sheets, deep in sleep, her breathing rhythmic and unbothered. She looked innocent, almost like the woman he had married 6 years ago, before the ambition and the disappointment had hardened her features. He looked at her for a long minute, memorizing the face of the person who had killed the man he used to be. There was no tearful goodbye, no urge to shake her awake and scream, just a hollow void where his love used to live. He went to the closet and pulled down a single, battered leather duffel bag, a relic from his college days. He didn't pack clothes. He packed his sketchbooks. He packed his laptop. He packed the drafting pencils his father had given him. The Armani suits, the Patek Philippe watch she had bought him for their anniversary, the life she had curated for him. He left it all hanging in the cedar-lined darkness. He moved back to the kitchen. On the granite island, a stack of unopened envelopes sat like an accusation. Final notice, overdue, collection agency. They were addressed to him, but the debt was the cost of trying to keep up with her world. Gabriel reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding band. It was a simple platinum band, scratched from years of drafting and site visits. He placed it carefully on top of the red-stamped past due bill. The metal made a sharp clink against the granite. It was the only payment he had left to give. He didn't write a note. Words were for people who expected to be heard, and he knew now that Elena had stopped listening years ago. A note would be a plea, and he was done begging. Gabriel shouldered the bag. He walked to the front door, his hand hovering over the handle. He took one last look at the apartment, the prison of glass and steel he had built for a woman who despised him. He opened the door and stepped out. The latch clicked shut behind him, a sound final and absolute like the closing of a coffin. He didn't take the elevator. He took the stairs, descending 42 flights, disappearing into the belly of the city before the sun could rise to expose his shame. By the time Elena woke up to find the ring, Gabriel Thorne would already be a ghost. Seattle was a city of gray, a monochromatic canvas that matched Gabriel's soul. For the first 6 months, he didn't live. He merely existed. He rented a basement studio in the industrial district, a space that smelled of damp concrete and rust, far removed from the gold-leafed opulence of Chicago. His furniture consisted of a mattress on the floor and a massive second-hand drafting table that took up half the room. He ate instant noodles, drank bitter coffee, and spoke to no one. The silence he had craved in the penthouse was now his only companion, but it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the echo of Elena's laugh on the terrace. Pathetic. He didn't fight the voice. He used it. He stopped shaving. He stopped checking the news. He funneled every ounce of his grief into graphite and paper. He wasn't designing houses anymore. He was designing systems. He began to map out the blueprint for Aura, a concept that merged biophilic design with self-sustaining energy grids. It was the green housing Elena had mocked, but stripped of its idealism and reinforced with cold, hard engineering. Year 2 was the year of the prototype. Gabriel worked 20-hour days, his fingers permanently stained with ink. He looked like a madman to the few neighbors who saw him, a gaunt figure in a hooded sweatshirt haunting the local hardware store for parts. But on the drafting table, madness was transmuting into genius. He developed a proprietary smart glass interface that could regulate a building's entire climate ecosystem without external power. It was brilliant. It was impossible. And it was his. By year 3, the hunger changed. It wasn't about food anymore. It was about conquest. Gabriel walked into a venture capital firm in downtown Seattle wearing a thrift store suit that was slightly too large for his thinned frame. He had no appointment. He simply waited in the lobby for 6 hours until a junior partner agreed to give him 10 minutes to get him to leave. Gabriel stayed for 3 hours. When he walked out, he didn't have a check, but he had a handshake. The first infusion of capital hit his account a week later. It was enough to buy a real suit, enough to rent a real office. Year 4 was the acceleration. Aura hit the market not as a construction company, but as a tech revolution. The Thorn passive home became the status symbol of the eco-conscious elite. Magazines that once featured Elena's PR campaigns now clamored for an interview with the recluse of the Pacific Northwest. Gabriel refused them all. He remained a ghost, a silhouette behind the frosted glass of his rapidly expanding headquarters. He didn't date. He didn't socialize. He built. He hired the best engineers, the most ruthless lawyers, the sharpest minds. He forged a company culture based on absolute efficiency and transparency, the two things his marriage had lacked. By the winter of the 5th year, Gabriel stood in the corner office of the Aura Tower, overlooking the Puget Sound. The rain lashed against the glass, but inside it was warm, silent, and controlled. He was 40 pounds heavier than the starving artist who had arrived in the city, filled out by muscle and expensive tailoring. The beard was trimmed, the gray at his temples distinguished rather than weary. His assistant buzzed the intercom. "Mr. Thorne, the acquisition papers for the Chicago Media Group are ready for your signature." Gabriel turned from the window. He walked to his desk, a slab of black obsidian that cost more than his father's house. He looked at the documents. Buried in the assets list was sterling PR. He picked up a fountain pen. The ink was black. "Book the jet," Gabriel said, his voice deep, devoid of the hesitation that had plagued him 5 years ago. "We're going back to Chicago." He signed his name. The stroke was sharp, aggressive, a blade cutting through the paper. The architect was dead. The emperor had risen. The conference room at Sterling PR was a glass cage suspended 40 floors above the Chicago Loop. The mood inside was funereal. Marcus Sterling sat at the head of the mahogany table, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better days. To his right sat Elena, her posture rigid, her fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the leather folio in front of her. 5 years had treated Elena well on the surface. She was sharper, colder, her wardrobe more expensive, but the lines around her mouth betrayed a constant, low-level anxiety. The agency had been bleeding money for 18 months, ever since Julian's creative accounting had triggered an internal audit. Now, they were being swallowed whole by Aura, the Seattle-based tech conglomerate that had seemingly come out of nowhere to dominate the smart infrastructure market. "Do we even know who he is?" Elena whispered to Marcus, keeping her voice low. "The CEO? He's never photographed. They call him a ghost. We know he has deep pockets." "Elena," Marcus snapped, his usual charm dissolved by stress. "That's all that matters. Just smile and pray he doesn't liquidate the division." The heavy double doors at the far end of the room swung open. The room went silent. The air seemed to be sucked out by the vacuum of the entrance. 2 assistants in severe black suits entered first, placing bottles of water and a tablet at the head of the table. Then, the man himself walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than Elena's car. He didn't walk with the hurried energy of a salesman or the desperate swagger of a climber. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. He carried no briefcase, no notes. He needed nothing. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. Her breath hitched in her throat. A strangled sound that was lost in the rustle of suits as everyone scrambled to stand up. It was impossible. The jawline was harder, hidden beneath a meticulously groomed beard that framed his face in shadow. The eyes were the same piercing blue, but the warmth that used to reside there, the softness that looked at her with adoration, was gone. In its place was a flat, arctic indifference. "Good morning," Gabriel Thorne said. His voice had changed. It was deeper, resonant, stripping the room of any other sound. He didn't shout, but the command in his tone made Marcus Sterling flinch. "Mr. Thorne?" Marcus stammered, his eyes widening as recognition slowly dawned on him. "Gabriel?" A ripple of shock went through the room. The executives exchanged confused glances. Thorne? The failed architect? Elena's ex? Gabriel didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at the team. He walked to the head of the table, the spot Marcus had vacated, and stood behind the chair. Finally, his gaze swept the room, landing on Elena. Time seemed to warp. For Elena, the last 5 years collapsed in an instant. She remembered the gala, the rain, the cruel words she had spoken on the balcony. "I'd rather sleep on the floor." She remembered the debt collectors, the missing ring, the divorce papers she had received by mail from a lawyer in Seattle, which she had signed with a scoff of relief. She had thought him dead, or homeless. She had told people he had cracked under the pressure. Now he was looking at her not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. "Please sit," Gabriel said, taking his seat. The movement was fluid, authoritative. Elena sank into her chair, her legs trembling so violently she had to press her hands against her knees. She felt nauseous. The man she had called a failure was sitting in the chairman's seat. The man she had cheated on had just bought her life. "As you know," Gabriel began, opening the tablet with a swipe of his finger, "Aura has acquired a controlling interest in this firm. I've reviewed the financials. They are unimpressive." He looked up, locking eyes with Elena again. This time, there was a flicker of something behind the ice. A challenge. "We have a lot of work to do," Gabriel said, his voice smooth as silk wrapped around a razor blade. "I expect everyone to justify their position here, starting today." He knew. He remembered everything. And as Elena stared into the stranger's eyes, she realized the terrifying truth. The husband she had thrown away hadn't just survived. He had evolved into something she wasn't sure she could survive. The boardroom air had grown heavy, thick with the scent of stale coffee and fear. For the past hour, Gabriel had systematically dissected the agency's portfolio, tearing through quarterly reports with the precision of a surgeon. He hadn't raised his voice once. He simply asked questions. Hard, structural questions about ROI, retention rates, and long-term viability that none of the executives could answer. Elena sat perfectly still, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. She watched him move around the whiteboard, drawing diagrams that corrected their flawed strategies. He wasn't just the owner. He was the smartest person in the room. The realization made her stomach churn. The man she had dismissed as a useless artist was now lecturing her boss on corporate efficiency. "Let's look at the Vance development account," Gabriel said, tapping the screen. Elena flinched. That was Julian's account, her fiancé's account. It was the agency's crown jewel, the one thing keeping them afloat. "The PR strategy here is optimistic," Gabriel said, his back to the room as he studied the projections. He turned around, his blue eyes locking onto Elena. Mrs. Thorne, or is it Miss Vance now? It's still Thorne, Elena said, her voice trembling slightly. She hated that she hadn't changed it back to her maiden name, hated that she had kept it for the professional recognition. Ms. Thorne, then, Gabriel corrected, stripping the name of any intimacy. You're the lead on this? Yes, she said, sitting up straighter, finding her defensive rhythm. We've positioned Vance Development as the future of luxury living. The engagement metrics are solid. We have a 90% positive sentiment score. Sentiment doesn't pay debt, Gabriel said flatly. He swiped the tablet, projecting a graph onto the main wall. It showed a steep red line plunging downward. Vance properties have a 30% vacancy rate. You're selling a lifestyle, but the product is failing. Your campaign is a beautiful facade on a crumbling building. That's hardly fair, Elena argued, a flash of her old arrogance surfacing. We handle image, Gabriel. We don't build the buildings. We sell the dream. The room went dead silent. She had used his first name. Gabriel paused. He placed his hands on the table and leaned in, invading her personal space from across the mahogany. Mr. Thorne, he corrected her softly. The correction cracked like a whip. And that is exactly why this agency is failing. You think you're selling dreams, ideal in reality. And the reality is, this campaign is lazy. He didn't look away. You're using buzzwords to cover up a lack of substance. You're projecting exclusivity to hide insolvency. It's the same mistake you made. Personally. The subtext hit her like a physical blow. You chose the shiny exterior of Julian over the substance of me. I want this strategy rebuilt from the ground up, Gabriel commanded, standing up and straightening his jacket. Focus on sustainability, utility, and actual value. If you can't find the value in the product, then perhaps the product and the account manager are the problem. I can't just rewrite a 6-month campaign in a day, Elena stammered, her composure shattering. Then you'll do it in a night, Gabriel said, checking his watch. I expect a new proposal on my desk by 8 tomorrow morning. If you can't handle the workload, I'm sure there are plenty of junior associates hungry for your office. He turned to Marcus, who looked ready to faint. Meeting adjourned. Gabriel walked out of the room without looking back, his footsteps echoing on the parquet floor. He left Elena sitting amidst her peers, stripped of her armor, exposed not as the rising star, but as an employee who had just been publicly dressed down by the man she once pitied. She looked down at her notepad. It was blank. For the first time in her career, Elena didn't know how to spin the story. The confrontation happened 3 days later, not in the boardroom, but in the glass-walled executive suite Gabriel had claimed as his temporary headquarters. Julian Vance didn't knock. He pushed past the administrative assistant, his face flushed with the kind of entitled rage that usually worked on contractors and waiters. You think you can walk back into this town and humiliate her? Julian demanded, slamming his hands onto Gabriel's obsidian desk. Elena is my fiancée. She's the mother of my future children. If you think you can use your little tech company to bully us, you're forgetting who runs this city. Gabriel didn't flinch. He didn't even stop typing. He finished his sentence, hit enter, and slowly closed his laptop. The silence that followed was suffocating. When Gabriel finally looked up, his expression was bored. I'm not bullying anyone, Julian, Gabriel said, his voice terrifyingly calm. I'm auditing my assets, and you are, by far, the most toxic asset on the books. I'm a client, Julian spat, straightening his tie, though his hands were shaking slightly. Vance Development pays your bills. Gabriel reached into a drawer and pulled out a blue file folder. He slid it across the desk. It stopped perfectly at the edge, inches from Julian's belt buckle. Vance Development hasn't paid a bill in 6 months, Gabriel said. I didn't just buy the PR firm, Julian. I bought the bank that holds your construction loans. I own your debt. I own your buildings. And as of this morning, I own the investigation into where the development funds actually went. Julian's face went from red to a sickly shade of gray. He grabbed the folder, flipping it open. His eyes darted across the pages, wire transfers, offshore shell companies, the paper trail he thought was buried. This is illegal to possess, Julian stammered, his bluster evaporating into panic. It's due diligence, Gabriel said, standing up. He towered over the other man. You have 24 hours to liquidate your position and resign from the board of your own company, or I hand this to the district attorney. Julian didn't argue. He turned and fled the office, looking small, defeated, and utterly ordinary. Downstairs, unaware of the slaughter that had just occurred, Elena was working late. The office was dark, illuminated only by the glow of her monitor and the city lights outside. She was trying to rewrite the campaign proposal as Gabriel had demanded, forcing herself to look at the raw numbers for the first time in years. She had always trusted Julian's accountants. She had never looked too closely at the invoices he asked her to sign off on. But Gabriel's words, insolvency, facade, gnawed at her. She pulled up the billing records for the Vance luxury account. She cross-referenced them with the vendor list Gabriel's team had uploaded to the server. A chill ran down her spine. There were invoices for consulting services totaling $3 million paid to a company registered in the Cayman Islands. The dates matched the exact times Julian had told her money was tight, and he couldn't pay the agency's retainer. She clicked deeper. The consulting firm had no website, no employees. Its registered address was a P.O. box. Elena stopped breathing. She scrolled back through emails, finding the messages where Julian had charmingly, urgently asked her to push through these specific payments to avoid project delays. He wasn't just bad with money. He was laundering it, and he had used her signature to do it. The elevator chimed, shattering the silence. Elena looked up to see Julian storming through the lobby toward her glass office. He looked frantic, his hair disheveled, sweat staining the collar of his shirt. "We have to go," Julian said, not making eye contact, grabbing her arm. "Pack your things. We're taking a trip. The Maldives. Tonight." "Julian." Elena pulled her arm back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the man she had left Gabriel for, the man she thought was a king. "What did you do?" "It's him," Julian hissed, his eyes wild. "Gabriel, he's rigging the books. He's trying to frame me. We need to leave until my lawyers can fix it." He was lying. It was a desperate, clumsy lie. And for the first time, Elena saw him clearly. He wasn't a shark. He was a rat on a sinking ship, and he was trying to drag her down with him. She looked at her computer screen, then at the engagement ring on her finger, a diamond she now realized was likely bought with stolen money. "I'm not going anywhere," Elena whispered, horror cold in her veins. "Elena, don't be stupid." "I said no," she said, her voice rising. She stood up, putting the heavy oak desk between them. "Get out." Julian looked at her, stunned that his charm had finally hit a wall. He sneered, the mask slipping completely. You're nothing without me, Elena. You think Gabriel wants you back? He's playing with you. He turned and stormed out, leaving her alone in the dark office. Elena sank back into her chair, the silence of the room pressing in on her. She covered her face with her hands, but she couldn't block out the truth. She had traded a diamond for a piece of glass, and the glass had just shattered in her hand. The silence in the building was absolute. The cleaning crews had come and gone, leaving the hallways smelling of lemon polish and emptiness. Gabriel stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the executive suite, watching the red taillights of cars streak down Michigan Avenue like blood moving through a vein. He heard the door open behind him. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was by the hesitation in the footsteps. "He's gone," Elena said. Her voice was small, stripped of the corporate armor she wore like a second skin. "I know," Gabriel replied, still watching the city. "Security escorted him out 10 minutes ago. His access cards have been deactivated." "I didn't know, Gabriel." She took a step closer, the sound of her heels muffled by the thick carpet. "About the money, the laundering. You have to believe me. I was foolish, but I wasn't a criminal." Gabriel finally turned. He leaned against the glass, crossing his arms. His face was unreadable in the half-light. "I know you didn't know, Elena. If you had been complicit, the FBI would be here instead of me. You weren't malicious. You were just blind. You saw what you wanted to see." Elena winced. She looked exhausted, her makeup smudged, her hair loose. For a fleeting second, she looked like the girl he had met in architecture school, the one who used to believe in art over profit. "I made a mistake," she whispered, tears spilling over her lashes. "A terrible mistake. I got lost, Gabriel. The pressure, the status. I thought I needed someone who could give me the world. I didn't realize I already had the one person who would have built it for me." She walked toward him, closing the distance until she was just arm's length away. She reached out, her hand hovering near his sleeve, trembling. "Can't we fix this?" she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I see you now. I see what you've become. You're brilliant, Gabriel. You're everything I ever wanted. We were a team once. We can be a power couple. The past. We can leave it in the past." Gabriel looked at her hand, then up at her eyes. He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in. He stood like a statue carved from ice. "You don't want me, Elena," he said softly. "You want the chairman of Aura. You want the man who owns the building, not the man who draws the blueprints." "That's not true." "It is." He cut her off, his voice devoid of anger, which made it infinitely worse. "Do you remember the night I left? The gala?" Elena froze. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. "I was on the terrace," Gabriel continued, his tone conversational, as if recounting a weather report. "I heard you tell Julian that I was pathetic, that you were repulsed by me. You said you would rather sleep on the floor than sleep with your husband." Elena's face crumbled. She covered her mouth with her hand, a sob escaping her throat. "Gabriel, I was drunk. I was unhappy." "I didn't mean it." "You meant every word," Gabriel said. "And you were right. I was pathetic. I was pathetic because I was waiting for you to love me for who I was, not for what I could buy you." He stepped away from the window, moving back to his desk. The distance between them suddenly felt like miles. "You're asking for a second chance, Elena, but you're asking the wrong man. The man who loved you, the man who would have forgiven you, who would have tried to fix it." He died that night. You killed him with your contempt. And he isn't coming back. So that's it? She cried, tears streaming down her face now. You did all this, bought the company, came back, just to punish me? To get revenge? Gabriel paused, his hand resting on the leather chair. He looked at her with a profound, weary sadness. No, Elena. I didn't buy the company to punish you. I bought it because it was a good investment. He sat down, opening his laptop, the blue light illuminating his face. I didn't come back to destroy you, he said, not looking up. I came back because I've outgrown you, and I needed you to see that I don't hate you. I simply don't need you. The room fell silent again, save for the hum of the hard drives. Elena stood alone in the center of the office, realizing with a crushing weight that hatred would have been better than this. Hatred was a connection. Indifference was a void, and she was falling into it. The sun rose over Lake Michigan with a blinding clarity, burning away the gray mist that had shrouded Chicago for days. In the executive suite of Sterling PR, now a subsidiary of Aura Corp, the light was unforgiving. It illuminated every dust mote, every fingerprint on the glass, and every line of exhaustion on Elena's face. She sat across from Gabriel one last time. Between them lay a single sheet of paper, her resignation letter. There were no lawyers present. Gabriel had insisted on that. He wanted this done quietly, without the theater of litigation. The terms are standard, Gabriel said, sliding a pen across the obsidian desk. You resign effectively immediately. We will not press charges regarding your negligence with the Vance accounts, provided you sign the non-disclosure agreement regarding the internal audit. Elena picked up the pen. Her hand was steady now, the trembling of the previous night replaced by a hollow resignation. She looked at the document. And my severance? She asked, her voice quiet. There is no severance, Gabriel replied, his tone even. You are resigning for personal reasons, and given the financial liability you exposed this firm to, you're lucky to be leaving with your reputation intact. That is your severance, Elena. Your freedom. She looked up at him, searching for a trace of cruelty, but found only the flat, calm surface of a man who had done the math and closed the ledger. She realized then that he wasn't trying to hurt her. He simply didn't care enough to help her anymore. She signed the paper. The scratch of the nib against the parchment was the loudest sound in the room. Done, she whispered, sliding the paper back. Gabriel took the document, glanced at the signature, and placed it in a folder. Then we are concluded. Elena stood up. She smoothed her skirt, trying to summon the ghost of the confident executive she had been 24 hours ago. She walked to the door, then paused, her hand on the brass handle. Gabriel, she said, not turning around. What are you going to do now? Gabriel looked past her, out the window toward the skyline where cranes were already moving, building the future he had designed. I'm going to build, he said. Elena nodded once, opened the door, and stepped out. The heavy click of the latch engaging was the final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. Gabriel sat alone for a moment. He didn't feel a surge of triumph. He didn't feel the rush of adrenaline he had expected. He felt light. The heavy coat of shame he had worn since that night at the Drake Hotel. The weight of needing to prove himself. The burden of her judgment. It was all gone. He stood up and buttoned his jacket. He didn't check his email. He didn't call his assistant. He walked out of the office, past the rows of cubicles where whispers stopped as he passed, and took the elevator down to the lobby. The doors opened, and he stepped out onto the bustling sidewalk of Michigan Avenue. The city noise washed over him. The sirens, the chatter of tourists, the rumble of traffic. It was the soundtrack of a living thing. He took a deep breath. The air was cold and smelled of exhaust and fresh coffee. But to Gabriel, it smelled like possibility. He looked up at the skyscraper he had just exited. He owned it. He owned the debt of the man who mocked him. He held the resignation of the woman who betrayed him. But none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that he was standing on his own 2 feet, owing nothing to anyone. Gabriel turned his back on the building. He adjusted his cuffs, caught the eye of a passing cab, and raised his hand. He wasn't Gabriel the failed husband. He wasn't Gabriel the vengeful ex. He was just Gabriel Thorne, and for the first time in 5 years, the blueprint for tomorrow was entirely blank. He stepped into the sunlight and began to walk.